Greetings and welcome to the University of Minnesota Alumni Association's webinar series. My name is, sorry, just hold on. I'm handling a technical thing right now. All right, we'll get going here. Sorry, there's a message about the recording. My name is John Ruzek, and I'm the Senior Director of Alumni Networks and your host today. I think we have a very interesting webinar on tap that will introduce listeners to the reality of dynamic polarities and their manifestations in ourselves, in interpersonal relationships, and organizational situations. But first, a few housekeeping items. Today's webinar is part of an ongoing free series being offered by the Alumni Association, where we have conversations with experts about career, life, and learning topics. Initiatives like this webinar series are made possible in part by our Alumni Association members. Thank you so much. Because of our members, we can create powerful opportunities for students and our more than 477,000 alumni around the world. If you're interested in joining the Alumni Association, check us out at umnalumni.org/membership. And actually, one of the things that membership is supporting is a free online resource from the Alumni Association that we think is going to be really helpful to accelerate student and alumni career development. We're calling it the Maroon and Gold Network. This is a free platform, and alumni near or far can share their talent and expertise with fellow alumni and students. You select the career topics you're willing to assist others with and how many times you'd like to be contacted. It syncs great with LinkedIn. So again, it's free. It's open to all U of M students, alumni, and faculty staff, and you can get started at umnalumni.org/maroon and gold. And then lastly, we have some great webinars coming up between now and April on how to get promoted, side hustles, and leading together, finding common ground in uncommon times, which is going to feature Dean Laura Bloomberg of the Humphrey School of Public Affairs. Just a few housekeeping items. You have joined the presentation listening using your computer speaker system by default. If you'd prefer to listen over the telephone, just select telephone. Audio pane of the GoToWebinar panel and dial-in information will be displayed. If you experience audio difficulties while listening, this can be maybe caused by having too many applications open or listening on a Wi-Fi signal. So close anything you don't need, maybe move to a hardwired connection. After our presenter is done with his webinar, we'll have time for some Q&A. So you can type those in along the way in the questions pane on your GoToWebinar control panel, and we'll definitely look forward to hearing from you. And now it is my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Peter Freeman, who's the principal for Full Circle Dynamics, LLC. He has over 28 years experience as a Jungian psychotherapist, coach, and mediator, educator and trainer, and organization development consultant to leaders and teams. He helps individuals and teams identify, bridge, and integrate the often contradictory and conflicting aspects within themselves, along with their interpersonal relationships and their team processes. He holds master's degrees in business administration and social work and a doctorate in organizational learning and development. He also was a full-time faculty member for the University of St. Thomas and St. Catherine University School of Social Work in St. Paul for 11 years. And that's where Peter and I first met and been exposed to his work, and just really excited to bring him to the webinar audience today. And so without further ado, welcome Peter Freeman.
Well, thanks, John. This will be a live analysis of John Ruzek, and I hope everyone enjoys it.
Hope not.
So today, the title of my webinar is Necessary Wisdom, Polarity Dynamics in Ourselves and in the World. And I really want to underline necessary wisdom, because I think that it really benefits all of us to have this kind of information in our consciousness and to work with that. So this is a piece from a David Foster Wallace commencement address. It basically goes like this. There are these two young fish swimming along, and they happen to meet an older fish swimming the other way, who nods at them and says, "Morning, boys, how's the water?" And the two young fish swim on for a bit, and then eventually one of them looks over at the other and goes, "What the hell is water?" And I think that talking about polarities and their dynamics is one of those things that we don't even think about. And so I think it is part of the water we swim in. And so hopefully that helps you answer the question, what the hell is the water? So John sort of introduced you to the idea of what I was going to try to cover today. And basically what I want to emphasize is that I want you to start to personally think about how you naturally and often unconsciously privilege one pole in any polarity over its opposite, and start to think about the complications that might come out of that and the limitations you might want to pay attention to. And the benefit is really recognizing and hopefully bridging those relevant pair of opposites, both transient and enduring, that you might experience within yourself, in between you and significant others, but also in the workplace. And so hopefully I can address things in such a way that it's useful in all those levels. So here are the sense of the topics that I'm going to touch base with today. Clearly there's so much depth in each one of these, and so in about a 35-40 minute webinar, I'm not really going to be able to go into great depth in each, but I want to introduce you to how it applies on all these different levels. So this is your list of what we're going to touch base with today, and I think we'll start out. This is a piece from British psychiatrist R.D. Laing, and I love it because it's kind of a tongue twister. The range of what we think and do is limited by what we fail to notice. And because we fail to notice that we fail to notice, there's little we can do to change until we notice how failing to notice shapes our thoughts and deeds. I love this picture because it's so placid looking, right? It's like this looks like a country home, and it just looks like really warm and cozy until you see the whole picture. And this was a fire that occurred in Durango, Colorado back in 2002, but it sort of captures what potentially can happen if we aren't aware of the full range of any particular polarity that we're dealing with. So what is a polarity? A polarity is an interdependent pair of opposites. An active attention to both poles is necessary and desirable over time for a sustainable self, relationship, or system. So this is where this intrapersonal, interpersonal, and group and organizational kind of application comes in. So it's scalable. And I'm hoping that you are able to take it in and use it in all your different environments. So one pole within this polarity is what we'll call the default motivational value. And the other is the interdependent value that we easily overlook. And oftentimes we'll have a negative reaction toward. So routine rejection or even unconscious awareness or neglect of the non-preferred pole will eventually create some problems. Internally, it might be even something like depression or anxiety. We don't understand what the source of that is. Sort of instinctual aversion to particular ways of being in the world. Interpersonal difficulties, and we don't even realize that the other person is manifesting a different aspect of a polarity that we aren't in touch with. And the reality in the end is that life demands both sides of any polarity. I think you'll see that as we go on. So there's a lot of verbiage here. I apologize for it. I am a Jungian, but I want to introduce you to some key concepts that I think can come into play. And this is Jung's map of the psyche. And we're all used to thinking about the ego as sort of our sense of self. But I'm going to use it in a slightly different way. Ego, in this case, is the center of consciousness. It is the executive function of consciousness. It's meant to mediate between the interior world, including the unconscious, and also the external world. And it is what we typically refer to as I. It is the way we think of I. Well, in addition to that, and I think a great addition that Jung made in terms of describing our experience is the notion of persona. And Jung talked about persona as the mask, which is what persona originally means. I think it's Latin. And the persona is an absolutely necessary psychological function that allows us to connect to the environment and to collective behaviors, skills, beliefs, whatever else. A healthy persona is absolutely essential. Without it, we can't connect to the external world. Difficulty becomes that if the persona becomes too rigid, then we lose connection with our truer self. So it can become a false self. All of us develop persona in our families, in our cultures, but professionally, everyone who is listening who has been through any kind of educational process, professional development, has developed persona. So the persona of a physician is very different from the persona of a woodworker because there are different requirements for that particular role in society. So you can think of persona as role. It's how we fit in socially and professionally. And those people who are unable to or unwilling to develop persona that allows them to connect to the external world either will not even connect to the world, which is one of the things I see sometimes with clients in counseling, but also can be marginalized. And so this has certain implications in terms of social status. I would say racism fits into this. There are some times that a dominant persona, socially sanctioned persona, just doesn't fit for everyone. And it can't fit for everyone, and it's over rigidified. So this is really important. Now, the ego oftentimes over-identifies with a persona. So when I was a professor, it would be easy enough for me to think of myself as a professor, what that means, and try to limit anything that would undermine that. All of us in our professional lives want to look like we know what we're doing. And so we develop our skills. That's part of our persona. I mean, there's something genuine to it, but the external world is looking to us to see whether or not we really match up with what they're expecting from us. Now, the other side of the ego, so to speak, we would call the shadow. These are all those aspects that run counter to persona. So Jung would talk about persona as a compromise between the ego and the outside world. So it really is externally focused. So anything that doesn't fit that really has to be pushed aside. Okay, it is counter to those values and it is repressed. It also does include our dark histories, painful episodes we may have experienced. So many times you'll hear people talk about shadow, and they will talk about it more in terms of personal history that needs to be worked through. Shadow is much broader than that. I think shadow you can think of as what I don't see, what I'm unconscious of. Some of those things are things I don't want to be conscious of. Others I've never really been exposed to. And in Jung's map of the psyche, the self is the overarching center of the psyche. It includes both the bright and the dark. It is within it the unification of those. The more we can embrace that, the more healthy we will be. So here's sort of a depiction of it. You can see the persona as it's directed towards the external world. And the ego, I have the star in the center there, and that really is that the ego thinks it's the center of the psyche and really rejects anything that comes in from the unconscious oftentimes as noise in the system. But in reality, that shadow is always present and is actually something to be embraced, but it's not fun. Shadow is not pretty. I guess you could argue that integrating it is beautiful, but actually doing that is not a pleasant experience until we just routinely look for what am I not seeing? And that's part of what we'll be talking about today. So in this case, I've sort of split out the conscious, which I'm putting persona and ego together, which is personality preferences. Many of you have done Myers-Briggs, I'm sure. Socialized expectations, our professional personas, how we show up in our professions, our motivational values in the polarities that we'll talk about, and our preferred polarity pole. Counter to that falls into the unconscious, unused, rejected aspects of personality, the non-preferred pole, unrealized potential. So there's gold in that darkness that needs to be plumbed in order for us to grow and become more than we imagined we could be, because we're integrating more. Necessary interdependent values compared to the motivational values. Unprocessed personal history. And so that's sort of the fire that a lot of times we have to sort of pass through in order to grow. And socially unacceptable aspects. And there's an inherent conflict between the two, because that unconscious material is always trying to come into consciousness, and the ego doesn't really want it. Okay, so it resists it. So that's where the conflict comes in. A word about ego integrity. The ego integrity, I think, can really best be thought of as just really trying to maintain a sense of being complete and whole. And the ego will seek to do that, whether it relates to or identifies with the persona or the shadow or the larger self. I had one client who over-identified with the shadow. I mean, he told me he was the most messed up person on the planet. And when I said, well, okay, were you able to get in here today? Did you have breakfast? And started pointing out how he wasn't quite as inadequate as he was painting himself. He argued with me about it because he was really identified with that darkness in himself. And so it can happen either way. That experience of integrity really creates a sense of congruence, and we will do whatever we can to protect that. And anything that runs counter to that experience of the I is experienced as potential chaos or a loss of a feeling of completeness or wholeness, and will be resisted, ignored, rejected, or projected out onto other people. Here's a quote from my man Carl, as I call him. Mm-hmm. Our consciousness is so saturated with any form of worldview, belief system, or psychological way of being, so utterly molded by it, that the unconscious counter position can discover no foothold there, for the simple reason that it seems too much the antithesis of our ruling ideas. I think everyone can relate to this. The more one-sidedly, rigidly, or absolutely the one position is held, the more aggressive, hostile, and incompatible will the other become, so that at first sight there would seem to be little prospect of reconciling the two. But once the conscious mind admits at least the relative validity of all human opinion, then the opposition loses something of its irreconcilable character. So what I would ask everyone to do as we go through this is start to think about those situations in which you are really grounded in a particular way of being, and you will go to the mat, so to speak, to defend that perspective or that way of being, and keep that in mind as we go through this. A couple other concepts which are really important: confirmation bias, which is that tendency to interpret evidence, positive and negative, as confirmation of existing beliefs, theories, that reinforce one-sided perspectives of what's going on and how to solve problems. So if something comes in that really positively reinforces the way we think of something, it's sort of like, okay, all right, I'm on the right track. If something comes in that disagrees with that, we will tend to push it away. Or if it's confirming something negative that we already hold, we will add that to that side of the ledger. And repression, which is that psychological defense that's natural to all humans, where data or experience that are antithetical to dominant conscious thoughts and beliefs is routinely rejected as disagreeable. Now that might be feeling states, it might be theoretical perspectives, whatever it might be. And they fall into shadow. And once in shadow, there's a certain wariness of anything in the darkness there. We don't want to go there. It's like noise in the system, and it will be perceived as negative and threatening. We experience our shadows in a lot of different ways, and I think everyone can relate to this, in the content of our humor, particularly if it's directed externally. In our exaggerated feelings about others, both positive and negative. So I'm sure everyone has had the experience of meeting someone and going, this person just makes me grind my teeth. They drive me absolutely insane. And might turn to a colleague and say, isn't that true for you too? And the colleague might say, well, yeah, I kind of see what you're talking about, but I don't have the same reaction you do. So it's that intensity. Also, when we idolize someone, it's a projection of a positive aspect in shadow. So shadow, again, is not just negative, it's also positive. Negative feedback from others who serve as our mirrors. That feedback that we don't necessarily like to give. Those interactions where we seem to continually put people off in the same kind of way, but they're different people. In our impulsive and inadvertent acts, when all of a sudden we kind of behave in a way where we and people around us go, what was that? I mean, that wasn't the person I know. That's a clue to that there's shadow that's being stimulated. Situations where we are humiliated. Shame has a role in shadow. We avoid shadow. We avoid letting other people see it, okay? And in those aspects of our lives and relationships that just don't seem to work right, So for instance, I'm really an intuitive guy, and so detail is not one of my favorite aspects. And so if I don't pay attention to detail, it just kind of goes off the edge. And so that's when I know I have to redirect into an area that I would rather not redirect. So this is a graphic that I use with clients a lot of times, and it's really how we end up distorting shadow aspects. So let's say there's a situation that we'll call a rat, okay? And there's something to it. I mean, there's something uncomfortable about it, unsavory about it. I mean, after all, the rat does have sharp teeth and claws. So we have to pay attention to it. But because of projection, what we end up doing is creating this larger illusion that really isn't reality. And so when we're trying to wrestle with this large distorted image, whatever it might be, we can't quite get our arms around it, and we won't be able to deal with it effectively. And so the goal is to bring the whole thing back down to the real rat, so to speak, and deal with the real rat. Okay. So the net effect in polarities of what I've just introduced you to. Remember, we have motivational values that are our default, and we can readily see the positives and benefits of those. Without awareness, the interdependent value, which is always existent, is tinged with this negative shadow quality and is typically seen in good, bad, yes, no terms to be avoided. So an example of a positive polarity, stability and change. Now the thing is, that is not a continuum. They are opposites and that's true of all polarities. They are opposites that coexist, that really need each other over time in order for the system to function most effectively. So obviously an organization or even an individual who just is so grounded in stability and just can't seem to move beyond that is stuck. And it's really a problem. They need to be able to change, but they're afraid of change. Someone who is always oriented towards change If they don't also build in stability, they're going to have trouble. Okay, so they're both necessary. So what happens with this situation is what we typically find ourselves doing is experiencing those polarities where the default motivational value is seen as positive, and the interdependent value is not seen in its positive aspect, but it is seen as a negative quality. So in this case, stability, and the opposite would be chaos. And so, of course, chaos is to be avoided, so I dig in even more to maintain stability. Projection is internally rejected, repressed aspects of the individual or group that are unconsciously projected onto other individuals or groups who manifest those aspects naturally, but they're seen as negative factors to be dismissed or avoided. And a person who's consciously organized around structure, for instance, routinely avoids spontaneity, will find spontaneous people or situations disagreeable. They aren't thinking that they are reacting to spontaneity as a pole in a polarity. They're thinking it's a quality about that other person that they find disagreeable. So it's personalized into that individual or group, and not until we're aware, we don't pull back and go, okay, I get where they're coming from. It's uncomfortable for me because I'm really organized in this particular way, but there's something, and going back to what Jung said, there is something relatively true for me as well in the way they are. And maybe I need to pay attention to that in myself. So here are some personal polarities that I sort of threw up, and I think all of us can relate to these. Well, of course we can, because these are all aspects of all of us. So facts and possibilities. Realistic, imaginative, power and love, planned and spontaneous, expressive and contained. So on one side you have the motivational value, and the other is its necessary and ever-present interdependent value that also needs to be consciously noted and energy directed toward. So, okay, in this case, I've got certain things listed here under motivational value. We can flip that. So for some people, the motivational value is possibilities, and the facts are the thing that is more remote, or action. Some people are oriented towards reflection, and action is the thing that they do less frequently. Other people are oriented towards action, and reflection is something that they do less routinely. Okay, so a tool for understanding this, one, is the Myers-Briggs. So here's just an example. I mean, this isn't exhaustive, but extroversion and introversion, object and subject. Some of us are introverts and we just naturally orient towards a subject, and the object being external is just kind of a little too much. Or facts and possibilities, or thinking and feeling, the objective and the subjective. So if you have this as your particular tool, you can start thinking about, okay, what am I neglecting? And where do I have continual kind of difficulties? Here are some interpersonal polarities. Care for self, care for others. Systematic, casual, initiate, follow, intimate, private. Clearly, I mean, not exclusively, but I mean, if we talked about males and females in our culture, women tend more to be intimate and about feelings and their internal worlds, and men will tend to be more private about that if they're even in touch with it. Okay, and so all of these have their application. So being able to identify in an interpersonal situation, are we dealing with a polarity between us? And if we start looking at it that way, it's not about John, you're such a whatever. It's, oh, okay, I see how you're wired, and I'm wired differently, and you have something that actually I need more of, and I have something that you need more of, and okay, I can start developing myself. So this is just sort of a list of some, but not exclusive, polarities. And you can see that they start to flow ultimately from our own particular personal preferences. And then here are some organizational polarities: stability and change, quality and cost, part and whole, employee needs, organization needs. I won't read all these. I did my dissertation at a corporation that wanted, it was a division with a number of business units within it. And the organization wanted the business units to get together and improve the performance of the overall division. It was a part whole polarity. Well, they were all incentivized around their part. So as they, as individuals, performed, they would get their incentives. They weren't incentivized about sacrificing their own goals in any way, shape, or form in favor of the whole. And so there was a tension there. And so the need to think about, how do we go about doing this? Now I'm going to touch base with scapegoating as a group phenomenon in terms of what I'm talking about. The scapegoat carries a negative projection for the group, and it allows the group to feel whole. Well, that leaves someone on the outside, right? So you have your group equivalents to what we were talking about before. Group persona is how the mainstream looks, how it does things. Group ego is how it defines itself. Group shadow is what's outside of those preferred ways of being. And the group self is the higher potential that can be harnessed if both sides of perhaps multiple polarities are worked with. So here's sort of a sense of what creates a sense of unity in groups: orderly processes, shared values and philosophy, a sense of solidarity, similar culture, lifestyle, and persona, understood group culture, minimal perceived chaos, minimal dissonance, similar personalities, gender, racial, ethnic background, sexual orientation. Those are the things that are cohesive factors. And so anything that runs counter to that is seen as potentially threatening, as undermining. Scapegoating is when the shadow, the dark aspect, is projected onto an individual or another group, and that group is perceived as negative relative to the scapegoating group or individual. This is really key. Any shadow projection or scapegoating always, always, always says more about the individual or group projecting than the reality of the person or group that carries the projection. It goes back to that image of the giant rat. There might be something about that other person or that group that needs to be attended to, but because of psychological projection, that is distorted. And so it really says more about those projecting than those who are projected on. So here's an image of how that might look in a group. You have a group of 5 people, and there is something similar about 4 of them. And so they share that similarity, and they embrace that similarity without even necessarily thinking about it. But there's one member of the group who's an outlier. Maybe they're expressing an opinion that is counter to the group think. Maybe they are in some way different. So let's say it could be a group of 4 males and 1 female. And so the potential exists. I mean, it doesn't always happen. The potential exists that what that particular female brings to the table is a shadow quality for those 4 men. And so it can lead to scapegoating and sort of a marginalization of that one person. Now, it can also happen between groups, where the groups are organized around a particular sensibility, and all the negatives are attached to the other. I mean, you see this in politics all the time. So-called polarization that we're experiencing in our culture, you don't hear either side going, well, you know, we've got this aspect of our philosophy that maybe needs some work or isn't really applicable. Of course not. What the way we see things is right. The way the other people see things is totally wrong. And so those projections happen. Here's a tool. I'm sort of trying to be conscious of our time here. Here's a tool that Barry Johnson created as a way, he used it in organizations, but I think it illustrates what goes on in interactions between people with different motivating values. Okay, so in this case, I've taken competition and collaboration. Both of those are really important to achieve, let's say, organizational goals. Let's say person A is just, they're really into competition and they think that's where it's at, that's where the greatest success comes. They will be able to tell you, and you would list them out in this, using this chart, as all the positives of why competition is so great. They will just lay it all out. And they will be able to tell you often with great detail all the negatives of doing it otherwise. So that's what the arrow pointing from the upper left to the lower right indicates, is that usually when we're grounded in a particular motivational value, we have a pretty good sense of all the downsides of doing it otherwise, and we can speak to that. Meanwhile, someone who is really oriented more towards collaboration, they can tell you all the upsides of why we should be collaborating and why that's really the way to go, and all the downsides of competition, and really do it with great detail. So here's how everyone can take this kind of idea and work with any polarity that they identify, that you want to flesh out. And start out with whatever your motivational value is. Put that in the that box on the left, in this case where it says competition. And list out a few of the reasons why you think that that's the way to go. Next, for the other interdependent value that you've identified, list out all the negatives, because you'll be able to do it, because you've done that over time. You've recognized all the problems with doing it otherwise. Then, after you've done that, then start to think about maybe there are some positives to the other way of doing it. What are those? And start to sort of sketch those out. And I would even say, leave the negatives of the way you do it to last. I mean, you'll be able to come up with that. But by going through this process from upper left to lower right to upper right to lower left, you will really be able to flesh it out for yourself, with your team, whatever else, with a minimum amount of resistance. Because you will have, just within yourself, but also between people of different perspective, you will be acknowledging everyone's perspective in a positive sense. And you won't immediately get defensive about the downsides of the way you do things. And then what Barry did was, attached to that is identifying what the higher purpose and the worst fear is. Because those are things that both sides of people holding on to polarities should be able to buy into. Okay, so it might be the well-being of the organization or the success of the organization. People who are, in this case, competitive, they can buy into that, and they're shooting for that. And also those who are more oriented towards collaboration, in this case, will go, well, yeah, I'm on board with the whole idea of higher purpose too, whatever that is, the success of the organization. The worst fear might be the organization dies. Well, I think everyone would agree there. And then what Barry added, which I think is really good, is creating some action steps to ensure or try to ensure the positive potentials of each side of the polarity. So action steps in both cases, and then red flags for each. How will we know if we're getting too overloaded on the size of competition? How will we measure that? What will the metrics be that we can use, and who will be in charge of monitoring that? And also, what are the potential negative consequences of overdoing collaboration? And so then you have this whole picture that you can work with. And it really works well with teams and with groups where people seem to be at loggerheads about proper approach going forward. Parker Palmer said, "We'll not be able to capture the power of paradox," or in this case, polarity, same thing, "until we're willing to suffer the tension of opposites. Until we understand that such suffering, because it's not fun necessarily, it gets to be fun. As you start to do it more and more, you go, oh, that's cool. That's really cool. But at first, I would argue it's not fun. That such suffering is neither to be avoided nor merely to be survived, but must be actively embraced, for the way expands our own hearts, minds, souls, whatever you might want to say." So I apologize that I sort of threw all kinds of stuff at you. And I hope that you review this later, because you all get it, and give some thought to what are the polarities that I kind of operate with? What is it that I'm absolutely adamant about? And maybe there's something that I'm missing. And I like to think of it as the missing voice. So.
And if folks want to learn more about Peter's practice or reach out to him, we'll leave the slide up for a little bit. And now we have time for questions. So if you have questions, please type them in. We'll welcome them. You know, one thing, as I was listening to you, Peter, when we were talking about the shadow side, and it's kind of almost that passing phrase where you're talking about the untapped potential, the gold that sometimes can be on the shadow. I think sometimes I see that with maybe alumni who are, I'm not going to describe this very well, but maybe paralyzed because of a career change or fear of change, more in like, let's call it like professional sense, their career path, things like that. I don't know, I guess, are there ways that, as you've worked with folks, that just helpful ways that people can kind of tap that shadow to whether give them more confidence or recognize maybe the skills in the shadow that would help them in their career paths?
Well, let me go this way with your question. I have a lot of clients who come into me and they're saying, I'm miserable in my career. I can't stand it. So let's say someone's working as an accountant, okay, which is very detailed, very consistent, it's very repetitive, and we want it to be. We count on that. But let's say this person is by nature an intuitive kind of open-ended kind of person. There's not a good fit. And so in a sense, in order to meet the requirements of the job, they need to repress their natural tendencies. So in a sense, they push their natural sense of who they are into shadow. That doesn't mean they can't do the job well. They may do it very well, but they're left unsatisfied. And so what I keep working with them on is, okay, number one, where is your motivational value?
Right.
And are you really grounding yourself in that? And then, I mean, the good news is you've learned something about the interdependent value just by what you've been doing. So that's a benefit. But get grounded. So it's not about being stuck between the two, because we always have a default that's personal. Okay. And that's good.
Yeah.
I mean, we have to have a starting point, but it's just recognizing what that is, and then bringing in the other aspect that we've neglected. If we operate out of a non-preferred pole, we typically will have disturbance. We
Mhm.
won't be happy. We won't perform in the way
Sure.
that we might otherwise.
Again, if you have questions, please type them in. We have one from Jonathan online. Thoughts on the, is it efficacy of Myers-Briggs for an individual or groups?
I think it's great. I have used it both for individual counseling and for groups. I think it's an incredibly valuable tool in order for people to get a sense of what is most true for them, and to start recognizing how the difference is a valuable difference in others. Okay, so I think that it's often used in groups as this is what's positive about you. And that's great. So getting a sense of, well, this is what's typically true of an introverted, intuitive, thinking, perceiving type. And isn't that wonderful? What's great about the Myers-Briggs, which oftentimes is not really tapped into, is the downside of the missing part, the dynamic that plays out between what is dominantly experienced and what's kept in shadow. So I think it's a very important tool. I think application in groups, going back to that whole thing about scapegoating, you can have a group that really is very similar. Let's say it's a group of accountants who are really detailed sensing types and logic thinking types. That's where the center of gravity for that profession is. You have someone else who is an intuitive feeling type, okay? Can they do the job? Yes, but why do they feel isolated? Why do they feel like they aren't heard? The group's starting to recognize that all aspects of these individual polarities really need to be on board. If they aren't actually present in an individual in the group, finding some way to bring that perspective in because it's a necessary. Example, Chrysler years ago closed its Kenosha, Wisconsin plant. It was a solid business decision. We could even say that it's a sensing, thinking kind of decision, concrete, logical decision. No consideration was given to how that would impact the community. No thought was given to the displacement of workers. Those are much more possibility and feeling or relational kind of considerations. Many corporations have used the Myers-Briggs or other tools like it to start identifying what are we not paying attention to, because they get bitten in the butt when they don't pay attention to it. So I think it's a remarkable tool. There is a step 2 version, which actually has 5 subscales in each of the 4 scales. Really, I think it's very useful. And I use it routinely with individual clients.
Awesome. And again, folks, we have about 10 minutes left. And if you have questions, feel free to type them in. We welcome them. One other thing, as I was listening to your presentation, Peter, thinking about maybe not individually, but maybe like in groups or teams, the group think as far as when we project, you know, an opinion or value on another group at work, that creates, like you were talking about, that larger illusion, the unreality, the, you know, Department X is always out to get us, and, you know, things like that. From your work with, you know, leaders and in companies and organizations, what's been the, I mean, what have been some good strategies to kind of break that? Because I know even like sometimes, even in my own work, or I've seen it in others, where it's like, not even beyond individually, we just fall sometimes into that group think, and, you know, it's always about the other people.
Well, it's very interesting. I mean, I worked for a social service agency years ago, and the clinicians were primarily social workers and psychologists, and their whole focus was on care for the client, okay, which is the mission of the organization. And so would advocate around that. upper management existed to ensure the sustainability of the organization. There was a different focus.
Mm-hmm.
So the clinicians in conversation in the hallways and whatever, I would hear things like, upper management has sold their souls to the devil. Okay. And so there was this real bifurcation, this real negative interpretation of the other side. Well, then one day I was standing in the hallway and I was talking to the assistant executive director, and she commented to me that the clinicians are like children. They don't understand how the world works. And so things like that happen within organizations. Another classic is between marketing and sales. I mean, it's just, number one, it's different personalities that go into those particular roles. And so you get this cross, and everyone projects the negativity on the other instead of, like, back to the clinicians and the management. It's sort of like clinicians need to recognize that they wouldn't be there to do the work for clients if it wasn't for upper management.
Sure.
Upper management needs to remember that the reason we're here is to serve clients. So.
Well, we have some questions coming in, and so I'll maybe try to combo a couple of these. So we have one participant who writes, how do you get your coworkers to start noticing what they're failing to notice? And then kind of in the same vein, we had another person ask, how would you suggest helping a coworker peer be more open to polarities? Is that via their, management or, one-to-one?
Well, let me take that second one.
Okay.
Going back to this, I think that in dealing with someone else who doesn't seem to be open to a polarity, starting out, if you can have the opportunity to have a conversation with them and really drawing out from them what they see as the real benefits and the value of the way they do things, of the way they see things, and really joining with them in an authentic way around that. And it would be good for you to actually experience that too. And then ask them, okay, if we did it the other way, what are your concerns? Again, in both of those, you are validating them. Okay, and so the resistance will be less. And then if you can move from there, okay, I can see the negatives. Really, you can't picture any kind of positives from doing it the other way. I mean, how about this? How about that? And then they might grudgingly go, well, okay, point well taken. I get that. But you've already established that you've validated the way they are.
Sure.
And then at the end going, and okay, are there any downsides to the way we're currently doing it? If you leave that to the end, you reduce the resistance, because that's really the whole idea, is how do I get the point across without immediately, and our natural tendency is to kind of jump in with, the way we're doing things isn't working for this reason, this is, and the other person's going to dig in to defend what they think is most true. What did managers motivate them?
Yeah, and so almost kind of like the other question was from a person who's a manager and speaking to the team. It's kind of almost in the same way, just reversing it. I
think the advantage of being a manager is that the manager is in the position where they can bring someone in and have a team building kind of experience that really tries to flesh out what is true for the whole group.
Right.
Maybe what's missing, in the gaps. So bringing someone in from the outside oftentimes makes it easier to get at these things.
Sure. And, and like whether it's Myers-Briggs or like a variety of teams over the years, I've done like things like Strength Finder and stuff like that, where it kind of shows, in my opinion, like polarities and differences of work style. But just even like going through that and then just having a conversation with, your fellow teammates about like, oh, this was kind of the results of my survey, and this is what gives me strength or motivates me. And I've always found those helpful, just because, you know, you like, for myself, it's like you always have your blinders on of like, this is my worldview and this is what works for me. But it's always great to hear. It's like, oh, this person, you know, really gets, you know, more empowered, or, you know, draws more energy from having some alone time at work or focus time at work, and isn't going to be like out in the hallway chatting and drawing up energy that way. But it doesn't mean he or she is any less warm towards you or like not engaged with the team. It's just different. And so just, I think sometimes that practice, whether it's, you know, through Myers-Briggs or other assessments, just having that conversation with teammates for myself has been really helpful.
I think it's incredibly valuable. I think that what often is missing is the grounding in polarities. Okay. It's sort of like, oh, okay, you need more alone time? That's cool. I get a sense of that, you know, and I would really much rather chat. Well, then we walk away. I have more of an idea of you.
Sure.
And maybe you have more of an idea of me, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's grounded in, and so what? And how does that come into play in the work we do?
Sure.
And how does the work we do require us to pay attention to polarities beyond just our individual differences? It's sort of like the overarching polarities that are at play in the work we do. And then I, as a personality, come into that particular polarity. And I have to adjust to it, adapt to it. I have my own particular contribution to make to that. But oftentimes, and again, it's sort of that feel-good aspect, and it doesn't go deeper into the polarities.
So we had another question come in. How do you get your coworkers to respect your polarity needs, i.e. you keep bending to their needs, but they never seem to meet yours or come
Well, I think that's really incredibly frustrating. I've been in situations like that. Most everyone at some point has been an outlier in a group. It's very frustrating. And that's why really sort of the educational piece that goes above and beyond the personal, so that it's really about what are the overarching polarities that are coming into play in what we're doing, okay? And then it's not so much personalized, because sometimes other people are resistant to me just because I'm an introverted thinking type, and you know they would do it differently, and so they might dismiss me as an individual more readily than they would the overarching polarity. But I would say that if you continually run into a brick wall and can't be heard, then after a certain point, you have to think about your exit card. And you've done your best to try to get the system, the other members of the group, to see things more holistically. And if they're not going to, then your own well-being comes into play anyway. And so I think you have to pay attention to that. And there are times when that's what I'm doing with clients. It's sort of like, you know, I'm the outlier. They aren't recognizing that what I'm bringing to the table is absolutely essential. Then it's, okay, is there another table I need to be at?
Sure. Yeah, and that's, you know, kind of as I was reflecting on some of the notes that I took during your talk, I mean, kind of those the opposites of like you know, planned versus spontaneous, facts versus possibilities, practical versus conceptual. I think those are things we can all, no matter what field of work we're in, we can all relate to that, just because there's always that push and pull of like, here's the vision, here's the concept, but then there's also the practical of like, well, this is what needs to get done. And, you know, obviously there's people in the workplace who maybe are more, you know, vision setting than like the people who like get the work done day in, day out. But yeah, having worked in a variety of different places, that always seems to be kind of that natural pull.
And also recognize there are always jerks You know, some people, no matter what you try to do to try to get them to see things slightly differently, are so rigidified. And I think at the end of the day, it's about fear, and protecting something, their own sense of self. But sometimes jerks are just jerks, and you're not going to move them off the dime because they have something invested in the way they're doing things. So.
Well, Peter, you are been an absolute great guy for being here today, and really appreciate the expertise that you've shared with our audience.
And by all means, if anyone wants to discuss this further or ask questions, shoot me an email or give me a call and ask your question, and I'll answer it as well as I can.
All right. Thanks so much, Peter.
Thank you, John.
All right. And we'll head on out here. Thanks, everyone, for sticking with us here during the noon hour. It's been great to have you. We have some upcoming webinars, and you can find those at umnalumni.org/virtual. And in closing, again, thanks to our members who make programming, both virtual and in person, possible. And if you'd like to learn more, visit us at umnalumni.org/membership. Thank you again for sharing your noon hour here in the Central Time Zone or wherever you are. Thanks so much, and we'll see you later this month.